Right now, if you pulled up a list of the world's largest economies, you would find the United Kingdom sitting comfortably in the top 10, a financial colossus built over centuries of empire, banking, and accumulated global prestige. Poland would not be in that conversation. It barely registers. But there is a projection quietly circulating among economists and policy analysts, and it is not a fringe theory. It is a data-driven forecast backed by GDP growth trajectories, purchasing power curves, and compounding structural trends. And what it shows is that by 2030, Poland's economy will have overtaken Britain's. This is a country that in 1990 was emerging from decades of Soviet-imposed stagnation, its industry gutted, its citizens queuing for basic goods. In the time it has taken Britain to argue about itself, Poland has rebuilt from rubble into the fastest-growing large economy in Europe. The numbers are now doing something that the political class in London has not yet found the courage to admit. In this video, we're going to answer 3 questions. What exactly broke the British growth engine? What has Poland done so right, so fast? And what does the 2030 crossover actually mean for the rest of us? To understand how shocking the 2030 projection actually is, you need to go back to 1990 and stare at the gap. That year, the United Kingdom posted a GDP of roughly $1 trillion. It was a G7 anchor economy, the 5th largest in the world, home to the City of London, and a financial services sector that channeled capital for the entire planet. Poland, that same year, was posting a GDP of somewhere around $65 billion. That is not a gap. That is a chasm. It is a 17-to-1 ratio between 2 countries that share a continent. Britain in 1990 had centuries of compounded institutional wealth behind it. Its legal frameworks, its property markets, its reserve currency relationships, and its seat at every major international table were not recent acquisitions. They were inherited. Poland, meanwhile, was dismantling a command economy that had spent 40 years suppressing the very market forces that create wealth. Its factories produced goods nobody wanted. Its prices bore no relationship to reality. Its citizens had lived through martial law within the decade. The story of the next 30 years is the story of what each country chose to do with the hand they were holding. One country assumed the advantage was permanent. The other treated disadvantage as a design brief. There is a chart that haunts British economic policymakers, and it tracks UK productivity growth from 2008 onward. Before the financial crisis, the line climbed, modestly but consistently. Then 2008 arrives, and the line does something that almost no comparable developed economy has managed to replicate quite so stubbornly. It flatlines. Not for a year or 2 of post-crisis recovery, for 15 years. Real wages in the United Kingdom in 2023 were barely above where they stood in 2008, in inflation-adjusted terms. That is a lost generation of earnings, compressed into a single statistic. The mechanisms behind this are not mysterious. Chronic underinvestment in capital equipment meant British workers were operating with older, less efficient tools than their European counterparts. Public and private R&D spending lagged persistently behind Germany, France, and the Nordic bloc. Austerity policies pursued after 2010 hollowed out the state capacity that typically seeds long-run productivity gains, from transport infrastructure to workforce retraining programs. The British economy did not collapse. That is precisely what made the problem so easy to ignore. It muddled. It generated employment statistics that looked acceptable on the surface, while masking an economy that was running on the fumes of its own accumulated prestige, rather than building anything genuinely new. And while London congratulated itself on its service sector dominance, something was being constructed at speed on the other side of the continent. The referendum result arrived in June 2016, and for a significant portion of the British political establishment, it felt like the beginning of a liberation. The bureaucratic constraints of Brussels would fall away. Trade deals would be struck with the dynamic economies of Asia and the Americas. Britain would rediscover its instinct for commerce, unshackled from a bloc it had always held at arm's length. What followed was considerably less triumphant. Leaving the single market did not simply mean paperwork. It meant introducing friction into supply chains that had been operating seamlessly for decades. Lorry drivers now need different documentation. food exporters faced sanitary and phytosanitary checks that simply had not existed before. Financial services firms lost the passporting rights that had allowed them to sell products across the EU from a London base, and Dublin, Amsterdam and Frankfurt absorbed the business they could not afford to lose. The labour market consequences were equally severe in ways that tend to get undercounted. An estimated 300,000 EU nationals left the United Kingdom in the years following the referendum. They had been filling roles in logistics, agriculture, food processing, healthcare and construction, sectors that could not simply automate the gap overnight. Vacancy rates in those industries spiked. Output fell. Inflation in food prices hit British consumers harder than almost anywhere else in Western Europe. The friction was not theoretical. It was paid for at the checkout, on the building site, and in the waiting room. And while Britain was absorbing these self-inflicted headwinds, Poland was doing something that deserves its own chapter entirely. Because what Warsaw built in the same period was nothing short of a masterclass in deliberate strategic economic construction. When Poland joined the European Union in 2004, it gained access to something that no post-communist economy had ever been offered before at that scale. The EU's Cohesion Fund mechanism, designed to accelerate convergence between richer and poorer member states, channeled a figure that now sits north of 160 billion euros into Poland over the following 2 decades. The question was never whether the money would arrive. The question was what Poland would actually do with it. The answer was infrastructure, systematic and at a pace that shocked infrastructure economists who had grown accustomed to European projects running decades over schedule. Poland built motorways where there had been 2-lane roads. It laid fibre-optic cable into regions that had been digitally isolated. It renovated universities, expanded technical colleges, and built the kind of intermodal logistics hubs that turn a country into a genuine manufacturing nerve centre rather than merely a low-cost assembly floor. The automotive sector noticed first. Volkswagen, Fiat, Toyota, and a constellation of Tier 1 suppliers moved operations into Poland not simply because wages were lower, though they were, but because the logistics infrastructure now made just-in-time manufacturing genuinely viable. Electronics followed, then business process outsourcing. Then, critically, software development. The country was not just assembling components for richer economies. It was building the technical capacity to compete with them directly. The cohesion funds did not create Polish ambition. They turbocharged an ambition that was already there, waiting for the capital to give it traction. For years, the movement of Polish workers to the United Kingdom was treated as one of the defining economic stories of the post-2004 EU expansion. Polish plumbers in London became a cultural shorthand, a symbol of free movement working exactly as its architects intended. At its peak, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Polish nationals were living and working in the UK, sending remittances home, filling skill gaps in a British economy that had grown dependent on their labour. That flow is now reversing, and the reversal is not a trickle, it is a structural shift. As Polish wages have risen, and Warsaw's tech ecosystem has matured into something genuinely competitive with Western European cities, the calculus that once made emigration rational has changed. A software engineer who left Krakow for London in 2010 could earn 3 times the Polish salary in Britain. That same engineer today is looking at Warsaw salaries that have closed much of the gap, a cost of living that makes London look almost punishing by comparison, and a professional environment built on familiar language, family proximity, and a city that has transformed beyond recognition in a single decade. The companies absorbing these returning workers are not small enterprises. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and a wave of Warsaw-based tech unicorns have collectively turned the Polish capital into one of the most active technology labour markets in Central Europe. The brain drain that Poland spent years lamenting has become, in the space of roughly 1 economic cycle, a brain gain. And back in London, the departure of that talent is quietly widening the very productivity gap we examined earlier. The story of who is gaining and who is losing ground has one more dimension that rarely gets discussed, and it is hiding in plain sight, in the price of a home. Ask most British people whether they feel wealthier than they did 20 years ago, and a significant number will say yes. The reason they give, almost universally, is property. House prices in England have risen so dramatically over the past 2 decades that homeowners have been handed paper gains that dwarf anything their salaries could have generated. The average English home now costs roughly 9 times the average annual salary. In London, that ratio stretches considerably further. The problem with this particular form of wealth is that it is largely immobile and intensely exclusionary. Existing homeowners benefit. Everyone else, and particularly every young person trying to enter the labour market and build an independent life, faces a housing cost that consumes an ever larger share of their disposable income before they have spent a single pound on anything productive. Consumer spending suffers. Savings rates collapse. Economic dynamism in the wider sense, the kind that comes from people taking risks, starting businesses, and moving to where opportunity is, gets suppressed by a housing market that rewards immobility. In Warsaw, the picture is measurably different. Property in the Polish capital is not cheap by Polish historical standards. The market has appreciated significantly. But purchasing power parity comparisons consistently show Polish households retaining a larger slice of their income after housing costs than their British equivalents. That retained income translates into spending, saving, and investing in ways that compound over time. The British housing market has long been mistaken for national prosperity. What it actually represents, in structural terms, is wealth transferred from the young to the old, dressed up as economic success. In February 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine changed the security calculus of every country in Eastern Europe overnight. For Poland, which shares a border with both Ukraine and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, the response was not merely rhetorical. Warsaw announced a commitment to spend 5% of GDP on defence, a figure that would make Poland the most heavily invested military spender in the entire NATO alliance, and one that would have seemed politically inconceivable in any Western European capital. What tends to get lost in the geopolitical framing of this story is the economic dimension. Defence spending at that scale does not simply buy weapons. It seeds entire industrial ecosystems. Poland has signed contracts with South Korean manufacturers for tanks and artillery systems that include substantial technology transfer provisions, meaning Polish factories and Polish engineers are building the hardware, not simply receiving it. Agreements with American and European defence companies carry similar domestic content requirements. The multiplier effects are significant. A new armoured vehicle plant does not arrive alone. It generates supply chains for steel, electronics, optics, and software. It trains engineers. It produces export capacity. It creates the kind of high-skilled, high-wage manufacturing employment that economists refer to as anchor industries, because they hold entire regional economies in place around them. Britain, by contrast, has spent years debating whether to meet the NATO minimum of 2%, a target it has circled without consistently achieving. The defence dividend that Poland is now collecting was available to any country willing to invest. Poland simply decided to collect it. The finish line is now visible, and the final calculations are more uncomfortable than most people in London have been willing to confront. Run the growth rates forward from where they actually stand today, and what emerges is not a partisan argument or a contrarian forecast designed to generate clicks. It is arithmetic. Poland has sustained average annual GDP growth rates that have consistently outpaced the UK over the past decade. When you apply those differentials to the current base and project them toward 2030, accounting for population dynamics, investment flows, and the structural drags on British productivity we have covered in detail throughout this video, the crossover does not look like a remote possibility. It looks like a scheduled event. The IMF and the OECD have both published forecasts placing Polish GDP on a trajectory that closes the remaining gap within this decade, with some purchasing power parity measures suggesting the crossing may arrive earlier than the nominal figures indicate. The British political response to this data has been notable primarily for its absence. What the 2030 crossover actually proves is a lesson that empires, institutions and individuals have been failing to absorb for the entirety of recorded history. Economic dominance is not a permanent condition. It is a continuously earned one. The countries that thrive in the next 50 years will be the ones that treat their advantages as temporary and their disadvantages as solvable, rather than the reverse. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, the single most valuable thing you can do right now is subscribe and turn on notifications, because the deeper we go into the structural forces reshaping the global economic order, the clearer it becomes that the maps most people are navigating by are dangerously out of date. The next video is already going to challenge something else you thought was settled.